I read every word on the Wonder Bread label. Here is my honest verdict. Today I picked up one loaf off a grocery store shelf and read every word on it. Not the front, the back, where the actual truth of a thing lives. The loaf was soft under my fingers, the kind of soft that doesn't happen by accident. There is a number I want you to hold on to for now, without explanation. 19 separate ingredients on this label for a food that traditionally needs 4. And by the end of this, I will tell you whether I would put this loaf in my own kitchen or whether there is a simpler bread that does the same job with almost nothing on its label at all. Tell me something honestly. If you buy this brand, when is the last time you actually turned the bag over and read what is printed there? Most people I talk to outside the community have never done it. Not once. Not in years of eating it. I want to know in the comments whether you have ever read this label start to finish before today, or whether, like most of us, you simply trusted the picture on the front and never turned the bag around at all. This bread carries a kind of trust that most products never earn. It has been on shelves for more than 100 years. It is in nearly every grocery store in this country. And for a lot of families, it is simply what bread looks like. That kind of familiarity does something to a person's judgment. When something has always been there, on every counter, in every lunchbox, you stop questioning what is actually inside it. The softness itself is part of the pitch. Softness reads as freshness, and freshness reads as quality, even when neither one is really true. A marketing term gets used for this kind of bread that is worth knowing. Ultra-soft, shelf-stable. That phrase is doing a lot of quiet work, and I want to show you exactly what work it is doing before this is over. I held the loaf in both hands before I opened it. It is light for its size. A full loaf weighs next to nothing, which tells you something about how much air is built into each slice before you even get to the ingredients. The price was modest, the kind of price that invites you to buy it without thinking twice, week after week, without ever questioning it. The front of the bag says, soft, delicious, nutritious, an American classic. The back says something else entirely, in print small enough that most people never bother to find their reading glasses for it. I learned to judge food before I learned to judge anything else. That part of me never left, and the gap between what a label promises on the front and what it confesses on the back is the first thing I ever learned to look for, long before anyone taught me to read anything else critically at all. This is what the ingredient list shows. First comes unbleached enriched flour, wheat flour with niacin, reduced iron, thiamine mononitrate, riboflavin, and folic acid added back in. That tells me plainly that the flour was stripped of its natural nutrients during processing, then had a partial substitute added back by law, the way a house gets repainted after the walls have already been damaged underneath. That is not a complete grain. That is what was left when the grain's own nutrition was gone, with a vitamin patch sewn on after the fact. Second on the list is water, which needs no judgment. It is simply water, doing what water always does. Third is sugar, listed on its own, ahead of the yeast that should be doing the actual work of making this bread rise and taste like something. Read that again. Sugar before yeast, on a basic white loaf. The plain conclusion is that this bread leans on added sugar for flavour and texture more than a basic loaf of flour, water, yeast and salt ever needs to. My verdict is not that this company is hiding anything. The word sugar is sitting right there in plain English, 4 letters, impossible to miss. No smaller print required to find it. My verdict is that soft and fresh for days requires a sweetener working overtime, on a food that historically had none at all. Not one grain of it. I bought this exact brand for years before I understood what that order on a label actually meant. Where I grew up, bread was flour, water, yeast and salt, baked the same morning it was eaten, gone in 2 or 3 days because nothing in it was built to last longer than that. We did not measure freshness in weeks. We measured it in whether the loaf was still warm from the oven when you cut into it. The first time I read a label like this one outside the community, I remember standing in a kitchen that was not my own, staring at the ingredient list, trying to figure out which of these words I would have recognized in my mother's pantry. Most of them I would not have, not one of them if I am honest. Further down comes calcium carbonate, wheat gluten, soybean oil and salt, each one listed as contributing 2% or less. Then comes a phrase that deserves its own breath. Dough conditioners. Contains one or more of the following, followed by a list of names most home bakers have never heard spoken aloud. Sodium stearoyl lactylate, calcium stearoyl lactylate, monoglycerides, distilled monoglycerides, calcium peroxide, calcium iodate, DATEM, ethoxylated mono and diglycerides, enzymes, ascorbic acid. In plain language, these are texture engineers. Their entire job is to keep a slice of bread soft, springy, and unchanged in feel for days after a fresh loaf would have already gone stale and hard in any normal kitchen. That is not a flaw hidden from you. It is printed honestly, right there in the list for anyone willing to read it. But my verdict stands plainly. That softness you feel under your fingers is not the bread, holding moisture the way a fresh loaf does on its own. That is the chemistry holding the moisture instead, doing a job that flour and water used to do by themselves. After the conditioners comes vinegar, which on its own is an old and honest preservation method, the same kind used in my mother's pantry for pickling and keeping things edible longer through a winter with no refrigeration to rely on. Then, monocalcium phosphate, citric acid, cholecalciferol for vitamin D, soy lecithin, and finally, calcium propionate, listed plainly as a preservative to retard spoilage. Read that again. The bag tells you in its own words that this ingredient exists to fight off mold and decay for longer than bread naturally resists it on its own. That is not deception. That is the company being honest about what the ingredient is for, right there in writing. My verdict is narrower than that. A loaf that needs a named anti-spoilage agent to stay edible for a week or two is a loaf engineered for the shelf, not for the table the same day it was baked. And there is a real difference between those two things, even if the slice in your hand looks identical either way. There is something else worth saying about that list of dough conditioners, because the names themselves can sound frightening if you have never seen them before, and I do not want to leave you frightened without context. Most of these compounds are approved, studied, and used across thousands of baked goods in this country, not only in this one brand. My objection is not that any single one of them is secretly dangerous. My objection is simpler than that, and it is the same objection I would raise about any food, anywhere. The more words a label needs to explain why a simple food behaves the way it does, the further that food has drifted from what it originally was. A loaf that needs 10 conditioners to stay soft has stopped being bread in the way my mother understood bread, even if every single ingredient in it is, taken alone, perfectly legal and perfectly safe. Now, I want to be fair about something, because a one-sided takedown earns no one's trust including mine. I am pleased to confirm something that surprised me a little when I checked it carefully. The high fructose corn syrup that some older versions of this bread were known for is not what the current ingredient list shows. The sweetener here is simply sugar, listed once, not split into several different smaller line items the way some other brands do it to make a loaf look less sweet than it actually is on a quick glance. That is a point in this brand's favour, and I will say so plainly, because I would expect the same fairness if someone were reviewing a brand I actually trusted with my own family's table. Subscribe is not the word I would use, but I will say this much. If you have ever stood in a grocery aisle wondering whether anyone is going to tell you plainly what is actually in the food on the shelf, without softening it, and without exaggerating it either, that is the kind of viewer who tends to stay around here. I am not selling you a lifestyle, and I am not asking you to leave anything behind the way I did. I left a community that already had very firm opinions about what belongs on a table, and I am simply still doing what I was taught to do before I knew there was a name for it. Reading the label, slowly, all the way to the end, and judging the food by what it actually says about itself, rather than by what the front of the bag wants me to feel. Before I give my full verdict, I want to be honest about the things this loaf gets right, because they exist, and pretending otherwise would not be fair. The flour is enriched with vitamins that were stripped out during processing, and while that is not the same as a whole grain that never lost them in the first place, it is a real attempt to put something back rather than leave the bread nutritionally empty on the shelf. The calcium added to this bread is genuine. 2 slices carry a meaningful amount, and for a household that struggles to get enough of it elsewhere, that matters more than a label reader might want to admit. The bread is also inexpensive and consistent, loaf after loaf, store after store, in a way that a small local bakery often cannot promise to a family on a tight budget. None of that is nothing. A fair fight gives credit where credit is due, even on a label I would not choose for my own table. I think about this every time I walk past a bread aisle now, even years after leaving. The shelf itself tells a story if you stand there long enough. Dozens of loaves, almost identical in shape and colour, each one promising something slightly different on the front, and almost none of them inviting you to read the back before you decide. I used to think that was simply how grocery stores worked, that the choosing happened with your eyes and your memory of a brand name, not with your hands turning a bag around to find the truth printed in small letters. It took me a long time outside the community to understand that the habit I already had, read first, decide second, was not common at all. Most people decide first, with their eyes, and only read afterward, if ever, usually after something has already gone wrong with their health or their trust in a brand they assumed they understood. There is a larger principle underneath all of this that has nothing to do with one bag of bread sitting on one shelf. Premium packaging, a long heritage, a familiar name on the front of a bag. None of that tells you what is actually inside, and none of it ever has. Only the small print on the back does that, and it does it honestly, every single time. If you are willing to stop and read it the whole way through, instead of trusting the picture, the slogan, or the memory of every other loaf with the same name you have ever eaten. So here is where I land plainly, the way I was taught to land on anything I put in my mouth. I would not buy this loaf for my own table, not because anyone is lying to me on that label, but because the list of what it takes to keep this bread soft for 2 weeks is longer than the list of what bread actually requires to exist at all. A basic loaf needs flour, water, yeast, and salt. This one needs 19 separate entries to do the same job, plus a chemical reason to stay soft past the point where bread naturally should have gone hard on its own. If a simpler loaf with 5 or 6 recognizable ingredients sits on the same shelf at a similar price, that is the one I would choose every time, and I would tell you plainly to go find it before you reach for this one again. I haven't bought a loaf like this since I left, and I don't plan to. So tell me one word in the comments. After hearing this whole label read aloud, slowly, the way I read it myself, would you still put this exact loaf in your cart the next time you shop? Or has something here changed your mind about a bread you have probably bought without thinking for years? I planted a number for you at the start of this, 19 separate ingredients, and now you know exactly what each one of them is doing in that bag, and why it is there. The promise I made you was a clear verdict, and here it is, as plain as I can make it. Read your own label before you buy, the same way I read this one, because the truth of any food has never been on the front of the package. It has only ever been on the back in small print, waiting for someone to finally turn the bag over. That habit costs nothing. It takes less than a minute, standing right there in the aisle, before the loaf ever reaches your cart. I learned it as a child, long before I ever imagined leaving the only life I knew. And it is the one piece of that life I carried out with me without hesitation. Read the back. Always the back. The front was never written for your benefit.